In the year 1578, inside the war tent of Japan's most feared warlord, a 16-year-old boy is applying makeup. But this isn't just any boy. He's about to share the bed of Oda Nobunaga, the demon king who's one castle away from conquering all of Japan. And in 3 years, this same beautiful boy will help orchestrate his master's death. Now, I'm curious, where did you first hear about this part of samurai culture? Was it from that one uncomfortable history professor, a late-night Wikipedia rabbit hole, or maybe from watching too much anime and wondering what was really going on? Drop a comment below and let me know. And hey, if you're watching this at work, maybe switch to headphones. The boy's name was Mori Ranmaru, and he holds the dubious honor of being the most famous wakashū in Japanese history. That's wakashū, literally young companion, though that translation is doing some heavy lifting. We're talking about the institutionalized system of nanshoku, or male love, among the samurai class. And before you think this was some hidden, shameful secret, let me stop you right there. These relationships between warriors and teenage boys weren't just accepted, they were expected. Required, even. It was literally in the job description. How did an entire warrior culture build a system where taking teenage boys as lovers wasn't just normal, but was considered the height of refined masculinity? How did saying "I don't want a teenage boyfriend" make you the weird one? And what happened when these beautiful boys realized they held more power than anyone suspected, when they figured out that they had the ear and other parts of the most powerful men in Japan during their most vulnerable moments? It turns out that when you give a teenage boy intimate access to the most powerful men in the country, you're not just creating a lover, you're creating a kingmaker, or in some cases, a king killer. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we discover that the samurai's greatest weakness wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the bedroom. Where the code of Bushido had some very interesting fine print that your high school history teacher definitely skipped over. And where we learned that the most dangerous weapon in feudal Japan wasn't the katana, it was a pretty face and good timing. But to understand how we got to the point where a teenager could topple an empire with a well-timed whisper, we need to understand the absolutely bonkers world that created this system in the first place. So let's set our stage. We're in Sengoku period Japan, 1467 to 1615, also known as the Age of Constant Warfare. And I mean constant. This wasn't your typical medieval, we'll fight in spring and summer, then go home for harvest season warfare. This was 150 years of non-stop everybody versus everybody cage match for the soul of Japan warfare. The country was fractured into hundreds of domains, each ruled by a daimyo who thought he should be running the whole show. It's like if every state governor in America decided they should be president and had their own private army to make it happen. But here's the paradox that makes historians scratch their heads. This era of unprecedented violence and chaos also produced the most refined cultural practices in Japanese history. The tea ceremony, flower arranging, poetry competitions, all flourishing while heads were literally rolling in the streets. It's like if the bloodiest battles of World War I were interrupted for afternoon crocheting circles. The Japanese had somehow decided that the best response to total societal collapse was to make really, really good tea and write poems about cherry blossoms. And honestly, respect. And right at the heart of this contradiction was the practice of Wakashudo, the way of youth. Now, to understand this, you need to forget everything you think you know about sexuality, relationships, and appropriate workplace conduct. The samurai had built an entire system around, let's call it, mentoring boys aged 11 to 19. Think of it less like a secret affair and more like an internship program. A really, really intimate internship program, the kind HR would have a heart attack over. These relationships had more rules than your HOA. There were proper poems to write, gifts to give, and a whole etiquette system. It was like Match.com meets Emily Post. Actually, let's not finish that thought. The older partner, called the ninja, was supposed to provide military training, cultural education, and career advancement. The younger partner, the wakashū, provided companionship, very close companionship, the kind of companionship that would definitely violate your company's fraternization policy. The whole thing was codified in actual written guides. There were books, instruction manuals, The great mirror of male love was basically the joy of cooking for samurai relationships. Except instead of recipes for pot roast, it had recipes for building character. Yeah, let's go with that. These texts would describe in loving detail the proper way to court a young man, the appropriate gifts for different stages of the relationship, and the correct poems to write when your wakashū was approaching that dreaded 19th birthday. Now you might be wondering, how did they justify this enter the Buddhist monks with the ultimate religious loophole? See, women were considered spiritually polluting. They would weaken a warrior's spiritual energy, make him soft. But boys were totally fine. The monks had basically convinced everyone that celibacy meant no women. It's like saying you're on a diet, but ice cream doesn't count because it's dairy. These monks took a vow of celibacy the same way your friend Steve is definitely quitting drinking after the holidays. There was always an asterisk, and that asterisk wore a kimono. The monasteries became what we might generously call boarding schools with benefits. Parents would send their beautiful sons to temples thinking they'd become holy men. They became holy men's boyfriends instead. It was a whole pipeline system that would make modern talent agencies jealous. The Buddhist justification went even deeper. They had this whole philosophy about how relationships with women were about reproduction and earthly attachment bad for enlightenment. But relationships with boys, those were about spiritual bonding and warrior brotherhood. It's the kind of logic that makes you wonder if these monks had lawyers, because that's some grade A legal reasoning right there. Your Honor, my client wasn't breaking his vow of celibacy. He was, strengthening his spiritual bonds with a teenager for enlightenment purposes. The samurai took this concept and militarized it. They called it the brotherhood of the battlefield, which sounds noble until you realize they took the brother part way too literally. The idea was that these relationships would create unbreakable military bonds. Your wakashū would fight harder to protect you, and you'd fight harder to impress him. It was basically a sexual pyramid scheme, and everyone was convinced it made them better warriors. Like CrossFit, but with way more uncomfortable explaining to do at family reunions. Every samurai was basically living that Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing at each other, except they're all dating each other's proteges. And this wasn't considered gay. That concept didn't even exist in their framework. Men were expected to graduate from being a wakashū to taking a wife and their own wakashū. It was just part of growing up, like getting your driver's license, except instead of parallel parking, you were learning how to write erotic poetry to your commanding officer. The age limits were strict. At 11, you could become a wakashū. At 19, you aged out no exceptions. On your 19th birthday, you went through a ceremony called genpuku, where you received your adult name and hairstyle. One day, you're the most desired person at court. The next day, you're yesterday's news with a bad haircut. It was like Hollywood, but with more swords and a much more definitive expiration date. And the competition for the best wakashū was intense. Powerful daimyo would literally scout for beautiful boys like they were NFL draft picks. They'd send agents to monasteries and villages looking for that perfect combination of beauty, intelligence, and, let's call it, availability. Parents would actually groom their sons for this, knowing that catching the eye of a powerful lord could set their entire family up for generations. It was stage parenting taken to a whole other level. No, Taro, you need to practice your tea ceremony. Lord Yamamoto is visiting next week and we need a new rice field. The whole system created this bizarre social hierarchy where your status wasn't just about your military rank or family name, it was also about how hot your boyfriend was. Showing up to court with a particularly beautiful wakashū was like pulling up in a Lamborghini. It said, "Look at me, I'm so powerful and refined that I scored this." Meanwhile, the poor kid is standing there thinking about how he'd rather be literally anywhere else. But hey, at least the food is good. Let me tell you about how this system evolved from weird but manageable to complete societal chaos. It started in the monasteries, as we mentioned. The most famous early example was Minamoto no Yoshitsune and his monk lover Benkei. These two were like the Batman and Robin of 12th century Japan, if Batman and Robin had a very different relationship, and Robin was a giant warrior monk who could bench press a temple bell. Their story became the stuff of legend, loyalty, devotion, and what chroniclers delicately called the deep bonds between men. When Yoshitsune was betrayed and forced to commit suicide, Benki died defending him, supposedly taking so many arrows that he died standing up, his body refusing to fall even in death. It's romantic, it's tragic, and it set the template for every samurai love story that followed. True love means dying horribly for your older boyfriend, became basically the motto. But things really got interesting during the Ashikaga shogunate. By the 14th century, what had been a spiritual practice in monasteries and a bonding exercise for warriors had evolved into something else entirely, a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, had what historical records generously call a collection of beautiful boys. This man turned the procurement of wakashū into a government department. Imagine having that job title on your business card. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Teenage Boy Acquisition. It's government work. Yoshimitsu was so obsessed that he actually built a special palace just for his favorites, the Golden Pavilion, one of Japan's most famous buildings. Yeah, that was basically the world's most expensive bachelor pad. He'd throw these elaborate parties where the entertainment was watching beautiful boys perform tea ceremonies and poetry recitations. It was like America's Got Talent, but everyone's underage, and the winner gets a really uncomfortable prize. Under his rule, the culture of wakashū reached new heights of absurdity. There were beauty competitions, fashion shows. Boys would be ranked like wines. Ah yes, the 1384 vintage from Kyoto, excellent cheekbones, notes of innocence with a rebellious finish. The court became obsessed with these rankings. Powerful men would literally duel over who had the more beautiful companion. People died over this. Actual sword fights about whose boyfriend was prettier. It's like if Instagram beef could actually kill you. But the real innovation came with Kabuki theater. Originally, Kabuki was performed entirely by beautiful boys. This was their Tinder, their Instagram, their OnlyFans, all rolled into one theatrical experience. Except instead of swiping right, you'd throw your family crest on stage. It was like The Bachelor, but everyone's a bachelor, and also they might kill you. These performances were intense. The boys would perform in elaborate costumes and makeup, acting out romantic stories that were barely veiled advertisements for their availability. The audience would go absolutely feral. We're talking riots, actual riots. Grown men, samurai warriors fighting in the streets over which actor was the most beautiful. The government eventually banned boy actors because they were causing too much social disruption. Imagine trying to explain to your wife that you got arrested at what was essentially a Renaissance fair meets a Chippendales show. Honey, I can explain it was about the art. And so they replaced the boys with adult men dressed as women, thinking that would calm things down. Spoiler alert, it did not. Then they tried using actual women. That also caused riots. Eventually, they just gave up and accepted that theater was going to cause civil unrest no matter what, which honestly is how all good theater should be. Which brings us to the main event, Oda Nobunaga, the Demon King himself. This was a man who burned Buddhist temples with monks still inside, who signed his letters Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. Not exactly a soft touch. He once made sake cups from the skulls of his enemies. He used to perform a weird dance at parties that historians politely describe as unconventional, but was probably just him being drunk and terrifying. This was not a man you wanted to cross, but he had one very public weakness, a beautiful boy named Mori Ranmaru. Ranmaru came from a minor noble family, the kind that had just enough status to get their foot in the door, but not enough to actually matter. His father saw an opportunity and basically pitched his son like a startup to Nobunaga. Look, Lord Nobunaga, you need a page. My son is beautiful, educated, and comes with a full warranty. What do you say? Ranmaru started as Nobunaga's page at age 13. By 16, he wasn't just pouring tea, he was carrying Nobunaga's personal seal, which was basically the nuclear launch codes of feudal Japan. He had gone from serving sake to determining the fate of provinces. Imagine being a 50-year-old general who's fought in 30 battles, and your career prospects depend on staying in the good graces of a teenager who's really good at pouring tea. It's like your entire Pentagon promotion being decided by the intern who makes the best coffee. Ranmaru had more influence over Japan's future than most senators have over a parking bill, and he wasn't even old enough to drink sake legally, if they'd had drinking laws, which they didn't, because they were too busy making laws about how to properly court teenage boys. The law books of the period are wild. There are more regulations about the proper treatment of wakashū than there are about murder. Priorities, people. The relationship between Nobunaga and Ranmaru was legendary even at the time. Nobunaga, who trusted literally no one, who had his own brother killed, who changed sleeping quarters every night out of paranoia, trusted this boy with everything. Ranmaru had access to all of Nobunaga's plans, all his secrets, all his vulnerabilities. He knew when Nobunaga would be traveling, where he would be staying, how many guards he would have. He was basically Nobunaga's personal Google Calendar, if Google Calendar could also warm your bed. Court chroniclers at the time described their relationship in terms that would make a romance novelist blush. They wrote about how Nobunaga's face would soften when Ranmaru entered the room, how the Demon King would actually smile, something he apparently did for no one else. One chronicler wrote that Nobunaga looked at Ranmaru the way a starving man looks at rice, which is both poetic and deeply uncomfortable. But here's where it gets interesting. Ranmaru wasn't just a pretty face. He was smart, really smart. He cultivated relationships with other daimyo, gathered intelligence, built his own network. While everyone saw him as Nobunaga's boy toy, he was actually positioning himself as an information broker. He was the Google, the Facebook, and the NSA all rolled into one teenage body. Let's open the historical case file on the death of Oda Nobunaga at Honnoji Temple. The official story: betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga was caught with just 30 men surrounded and forced to commit seppuku as the temple burned around him, and who died by his side, young Ranmaru, loyal to the end. It's a beautiful story of devotion. It's also possibly complete bull. But what if the real story involves a certain beautiful boy who knew exactly when his master would be most vulnerable? Who knew that Nobunaga had dismissed most of his guards? Who knew the exact layout of the temple? Who could have sent word to Akechi about the perfect moment to strike? Let's examine the evidence. First, the timing. Nobunaga was at Honnoji Temple with only a minimal guard. This was highly unusual for a man so paranoid. He usually traveled with an army. But Ranmaru had convinced him they were safe, that it was a religious visit, that heavy security would be disrespectful to the monks. The one person who could have convinced Nobunaga to lower his guard did exactly that. Second, the Mori clan's suspicious rise to power after Nobunaga's death. While other loyal retainers were destroyed or marginalized, the Mori family somehow landed on their feet. They went from minor nobility to major players overnight. It's almost like someone in the family had insider information about a major political shift. It's like knowing which tech stocks to buy right before a major announcement, except instead of insider trading, it's insider regicide. These boys weren't just arm candy. They were reading the mail, listening at doors, and occasionally rewriting history. They were the ultimate intelligence network. Think about it, who's going to suspect the teenage boy carrying the tea tray? He's furniture with a pretty face, except this furniture has ears, ambitions, and sometimes a very good reason to want new management. Let's look at the psychological reality of being a wakashū. You're taken from your family as a child, handed over to a powerful man who has complete control over your life, your body, your future. You know your value has an expiration date. The second you turn 19, you go from being the most desired person in the room to yesterday's news, literally overnight on your 19th birthday. It's like being a Disney Channel star, but with more swords and significantly worse contract negotiations. Some of these boys handled aging out about as well as your average NFL player handles retirement, which is to say lots of bad decisions and desperate attempts to stay relevant. The smart ones use their time to build networks, gather intelligence, accumulate favors. The not-so-smart ones, well, they ended up as cautionary tales. There are records of former wakashū trying increasingly desperate things to maintain their relevance, fake documents claiming they were still 18 primitive attempts at cosmetic surgery. One guy apparently tried to convince everyone he had a rare condition that made him age backwards. It didn't work. But the really clever ones, like possibly Ranmaru, understood that their real power wasn't in their beauty. It was in their access. They were present for every secret meeting, every private conversation, every moment of vulnerability. They knew which daimyo was plotting against whom, who was broke, who was sick, who was weak. They were like Renaissance-era WikiLeaks, except instead of hacking emails, they were literally in bed with their sources. There's a clear pattern in the historical record. Powerful daimyo with young favorites dying under mysterious circumstances, their families suddenly benefiting. It happened often enough that by the 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate basically had to create HR policies for teenage boyfriends because they kept destabilizing the government. Imagine having to write that memo. Due to recent incidents, all wakashū must now be registered with central administration and undergo a background check. They literally had to create a government department to manage this, the Department of Wakashū Affairs. It's like if the DMV also had to regulate your love life. Actually, that might explain why both are equally soul-crushing experiences. They had regulations about everything: how many wakashū a daimyo could have, what ranks they could hold, what information they could access. There was even a whistleblower program where wakashū could report inappropriate requests from their masters. Though given the nature of the relationship, I'm not sure what would qualify as inappropriate. The documentation from this period is fascinatingly bureaucratic. There are forms, actual government forms for registering your teenage companion. Item 1, name. Item 2, age must be verified by temple records. Item 3, previous employers. Item 4, special skills, tea ceremony. Poetry, flower arrangement, assassination. Wait, strike that last one. Item 5, please describe the nature of your relationship in the space provided. Attach additional sheets if necessary. The most damning evidence comes from a document called The Mirror of Modern Times, written by a former wakashū who aged out and became a government administrator. He basically wrote a tell-all memoir about the inner workings of the system. According to him, there was an entire shadow network of former wakashū who maintained their influence through their successors. They would train young boys not just in the arts of being a companion, but in intelligence-gathering manipulation and, yes, occasionally murder. He describes something called the chrysanthemum path, chrysanthemum being a euphemism for, well, you know. This was allegedly a secret organization of current and former wakashū who shared information and coordinated actions across different domains. If true, it means there was basically a secret gay mafia running parallel to the official government. They had their own codes, their own communication methods, their own goals. The real cursed chamber wasn't a physical room, it was the bedroom itself. A space where warriors who could face death without flinching made themselves completely vulnerable to boys they barely knew. The curse was their absolute certainty that these relationships made them stronger, when in reality they were creating their own assassins. They invited their greatest threats into their beds and called it tradition. Think about the psychology of it. You're a powerful warlord. You've spent your entire day making life and death decisions, commanding armies, playing political chess with other daimyo. Then night comes and you're in your private chambers with your wakashū. Your guard is down. You're vulnerable, intimate human. You tell this boy things you wouldn't tell your own generals. You show him fears you wouldn't admit to yourself. And this boy who you think loves you or at least desires you is memorizing every word, every weakness, every secret. So what's our verdict? The system of nanshoku wasn't just about sex or even mentorship. It was a parallel power structure that could make or break dynasties. These boys weren't victims or villains. They were survivors playing a game where the rules were written by their oppressors, but the overtime could be played by anyone clever enough to stay in bounds. When the Meiji Restoration hit in 1868, Japan suddenly had to look civilized to Western eyes. And wouldn't you know it, this whole wakashū system disappeared from the official history faster than your browser history when someone asks to borrow your laptop. They buried it so deep that modern Japan treats this part of their history like your parents treat those photos from the 70s. Yes, it happened. No, we don't talk about it. Moving on, the speed of this historical erasure was breathtaking. In 1867, there were official wakashū registered in every major city. By 1870, the practice officially didn't exist, and never had. The government collected and destroyed thousands of documents, paintings, and books related to nanshoku. They rewrote textbooks, redesigned museums, and basically performed the largest quadruple-plus in history. It's like if America decided to pretend baseball never existed and managed to pull it off. Hollywood gives us stoic warriors with a code of honor. The reality was those warriors were probably arguing over who got to mentor the new page. Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai. Yeah, they left out about 40% of what samurai culture actually involved. That movie would have been very different. Tell me the way of the samurai. Well, Tom, first you need to understand the importance of poetry and teenage companions. Actually, let's just stick with the sword fighting. The modern romanticization of samurai culture is particularly ironic when you know the full history. We see them as these paragons of masculine virtue, defenders of honor and tradition. The reality is, they built an entire social system around relationships that would get you put on a list today. Every time someone gets a samurai tattoo thinking it represents strength and honor, I think about how that samurai probably spent half his time writing poetry to a 15-year-old. It kind of changes the vibe. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets complicated. We can't judge this through our modern lens entirely. This was a completely different cultural context, with different concepts of sexuality, adulthood, and consent. The ancient Greeks had similar practices. So did the Romans, the Persians, various Islamic caliphates. Throughout history, powerful men have created systems that gave them access to young people and then convinced everyone it was for education or spiritual development or military training. The difference with Japan is how thoroughly systematized it became. This wasn't just powerful individuals taking advantage. This was an entire society, building institutions around it. They had government departments, official regulations, published guides, theatrical traditions, and religious justifications. It was abuse industrialized and bureaucratized to such an extent that it became invisible. It was just how things were done. The echoes of this system can still be seen in modern Japanese culture, though heavily transformed and sanitized. The senpai-kohai relationship in schools and companies, where an older mentor guides a younger protege, is a direct descendant of the wakashū system, minus the obvious problematic elements. The obsession with youth and beauty in Japanese pop culture, the complex power dynamics in manga and anime, the recurring theme of beautiful androgynous young men in Japanese media, all of these have roots in the wakashū tradition. Even the modern Japanese concept of kawaii cuteness as a cultural value has some deeply uncomfortable historical roots. When your society spent centuries valorizing youth and beauty as the ultimate currency that doesn't just disappear because you signed some treaties with America. It transforms, evolves, puts on a Hello Kitty costume, but the underlying psychology remains. This isn't just a story about sex or even power. It's about how entire civilizations can convince themselves that exploitation is education, that vulnerability is strength, and that love and ownership are the same thing. The samurai created a system where boys were currency, mentorship was grooming, and everyone pretended it was making them better warriors. The real tragedy. Some of these relationships probably were genuine, but in a system this twisted, how could anyone tell the difference between love and survival? When saying no means destroying your family's future, is saying yes, really consent. When your entire value is based on your youth, and beauty is any affection you receive actually for you. Think about Ranmaru for a moment. Did he actually care for Nobunaga? Was there genuine affection there, or was it all calculated survival? We'll never know, because the system made genuine emotion impossible to separate from strategic performance. Every smile could be sincere or strategic. Every poem could be heartfelt or manipulative. Every act of devotion could be love or ambition. The system poisoned even the possibility of real connection. And that's the ultimate curse of this chamber. It corrupted everything it touched. It turned education into exploitation, loyalty into leverage, love into a weapon. It made every relationship transactional, every emotion suspect, every connection potentially lethal. The samurai thought they were creating unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. Instead, they created a culture of mutual predation, disguised as tradition. The final irony is that the system ultimately contributed to the downfall of the samurai class itself. By the late Edo period, the warrior class had become so focused on aesthetic refinement, on collecting the most beautiful boys and throwing the most elegant parties that they forgot how to actually fight. When Commodore Perry showed up with his black ships in 1853, the samurai were more concerned with their poetry than their preparedness. They had spent so long performing masculinity that they had forgotten how to actually embody it. The Meiji reformers who dismantled the samurai class understood this. They saw that the warrior tradition had become corrupted soft, more concerned with beauty than battle. The abolition of the wakashū system wasn't just about appeasing Western sensibilities. It was about trying to create a modern military that could actually defend Japan. You can't fight a modern war when your generals are more concerned with their teenage companions than their tactical training. What other noble traditions are we romanticizing while ignoring their dark realities? How many of our cherished historical narratives are carefully edited to remove the uncomfortable parts? The knights of medieval Europe had their own version of this. The sacred bands of ancient Greece, the mentorship traditions of various cultures throughout history. Scratch the surface of any idealized past, and you'll find something that would horrify us today. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that the past was terrible, though it often was, but that human beings have an infinite capacity to normalize the abnormal, to make the horrific seem honorable, to convince themselves that their worst impulses are actually virtuous traditions. The samurai weren't uniquely evil, they were uniquely human, which might be even scarier. Let me know in the comments what other historical traditions you think need a closer look. And remember, history's greatest warriors weren't taken down by enemy swords. They were undone by the beautiful boys they invited into their beds. Like and subscribe if you want to unlock more of history's inconvenient truths. The past is waiting, and it's much weirder than your teacher told you.